In the spring of 1944, the Indian Ocean was, by the standards of the Pacific War, a relatively quiet theater. The major naval campaigns were unfolding in the Central and Western Pacific, where American carrier forces were systematically dismantling the Japanese defensive perimeter, island by island. The Indian Ocean carried Allied supply shipping between Australia, India, and the Middle East, moving the materials that kept multiple theaters of the war operational. And the ships that crossed those waters did so largely without the extreme danger that characterized the convoy routes in the North Atlantic or the waters around the Solomon Islands. Allied merchant crews sailing the Indian Ocean in early 1944 understood they were in a war zone. They understood submarines were operating in those waters. They understood the risks that every sailor accepted when the war made the ocean a battlefield. What none of them understood, and what no sailor serving on any side in the Second World War could reasonably have anticipated, was that a Japanese submarine crew would surface after a sinking, order the survivors aboard at gunpoint, and then systematically murder them with swords, sledgehammers, rifle butts, and bayonets, while some of the executioners sat in deck chairs and shot at swimming men for sport. This is the story of Submarine I-8, a vessel that entered the war as an engineering achievement, that completed one of the most ambitious submarine voyages of the conflict, and that ended as one of the most thoroughly documented examples of war crimes committed at sea in any theater of the Second World War. The men who commanded her in 1944 ordered actions that violated every law of war, every naval tradition, and every standard of human conduct that 5,000 years of maritime civilization had developed. They did this twice, in waters far from any witness, against men who had already survived the sinking of their ships and who had no means of resistance or escape. The survivors who lived to testify made sure the record existed. Begin with the submarine itself, because I-8's specific design and history before 1944 explains both how she came to be operating in the Indian Ocean and why the men who crewed her had come to believe that the rules governing the conduct of war at sea simply did not apply to them. I-8 was a J-3 type submarine, one of Japan's largest and most capable pre-war designs. She and her sister, ship I-7, were among the biggest submarines completed before the Pacific War began. She measured approximately 109 meters in length and displaced over 2,500 tons surfaced. Her crew numbered roughly 100 men. She could make approximately 23 knots on the surface and had an extraordinary operational range of 14,000 nautical miles at cruising speed, giving her the ability to cross entire oceans and operate indefinitely far from any Japanese base. She was built with a watertight aircraft hangar and a catapult system capable of launching a small float plane for reconnaissance, a feature that reflected Japan's pre-war doctrine of using submarines for long-range intelligence gathering in addition to combat operations. Her armament was substantial, a twin 140mm gun for surface combat, several 25mm anti-aircraft guns, and 6 forward torpedo tubes with capacity for 21 torpedoes. She was sophisticated, long-ranged, and powerful. A submarine designed to operate independently across vast stretches of Pacific and Indian Ocean water on missions that kept her away from Japanese bases for months at a time. Her early wartime career was active, but not remarkable by the standards of the Japanese submarine force. She participated in patrols associated with the Pearl Harbor operation in December 1941, operating north of Oahu to intercept vessels leaving the harbor. She conducted operations in the South Pacific, including missions around Guadalcanal, where Japanese submarines were attempting the impossible task of supplying isolated island garrisons against increasingly effective Allied anti-submarine patrols. Her direct combat successes in this period were limited. She was part of a submarine force that was being employed in strategic roles for which it had not been designed and that produced limited results at increasing cost. In 1943, she was selected for one of the most remarkable submarine missions of the entire war, a Yanagi voyage, meaning a willow voyage, to Nazi Germany. The Imperial Japanese Navy and the German Kriegsmarine were allies in name and largely strangers in practice, separated by geography so vast that meaningful cooperation required extraordinary efforts. The Yanagi missions were those extraordinary efforts. Submarine voyages that crossed entire oceans to exchange technology, personnel, and materials between the two partners in an alliance that geography had made almost purely theoretical. Under Captain Shinji Uchino, I-8 departed Japan in June 1943 carrying diplomats, technical personnel, raw materials, and weapons. She crossed the Indian Ocean, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, transited the South Atlantic, and arrived at the German submarine base at Brest in occupied France on August 31, 1943. The voyage had taken months and covered distances that challenged the crew's endurance. In Brest, she was welcomed by the Kriegsmarine, her crew toured occupied Europe, and the boat was fitted with a German radar system and various pieces of German military technology. When she departed in October 1943, she carried an array of German equipment, industrial goods, and technical specialists back toward Japan. She completed the return voyage in December after more than 30,000 miles at sea. She was the only Japanese submarine to complete this mission in both directions. The achievement was genuine, and the seamanship required to accomplish it was real. It is important to establish I-8's pre-1944 record because what happened in 1944 was not the inevitable product of her design or her history. It was the product of a specific commander who made specific decisions and issued specific orders that the crew he commanded carried out. The submarine that had completed a 30,000-mile diplomatic technical mission across multiple oceans became a vessel of systematic murder under a specific man's command. Understanding this requires naming him. Commander Tatsunosuke Ariumi took command of I-8 on January 15, 1944. He was a career submarine officer, experienced and competent by the standard metrics that naval service measures competence. He was also, as the events of 1944 would establish beyond any possible dispute, a man who had decided that the survivors of ships his submarine sank were not entitled to any of the protections that international law, the laws of war, or the most basic conventions of naval conduct specified. The specific decision-making process that produced this conclusion was not captured in any document that survived the war. What Ariumi thought about the laws governing the treatment of survivors, whether he had received any orders from above that influenced his conduct, whether the atrocities of 1944 were premeditated policy or situational escalation, was not fully established in the post-war proceedings and cannot now be established with certainty. What was established through the testimony of the men who survived is what he ordered and what his crew did. The first atrocity occurred on March 26, 1944. I-8 was on patrol in the Indian Ocean south of Colombo, Ceylon, when lookouts located the Dutch merchant freighter SS Tjisalak. She was a vessel of 5,787 tons, carrying a cargo of flour from Melbourne to Colombo. She was unescorted and making 10 knots, a perfectly ordinary merchant vessel on a perfectly ordinary supply run in waters that the Allied command had assessed as manageable risk. At approximately 5:45 in the morning, lookouts on the Tjisalak saw torpedo wakes in the water approaching their ship. The captain ordered evasive action, but 2 torpedoes struck in quick succession. The explosion stopped the ship's engines and jammed her rudder, leaving her circling helplessly as water flooded into the holds. The crew transmitted a distress call and began abandoning ship in 3 lifeboats. I-8 surfaced approximately 1,000 yards from the stricken freighter. What happened next tells you something important about the Tjisalak's crew. Rather than immediately accepting the loss and surrendering, her people fought back. A gunner manned the ship's Oerlikon 20mm cannon while the vessel was still above water and opened fire on the surfacing submarine. The ship's 4-inch deck gun also got into action and fired several shells toward I-8, compelling the submarine to crash dive twice. Only when the circling freighter's guns could no longer bear on the submarine, as she maneuvered did I-8 surface for good. By 6 o'clock in the morning, the Tjisalak had rolled onto her side and sank stern first. Approximately 100 people had been aboard the Tjisalak. Almost all of them survived the sinking and clustered in the 3 lifeboats. Their relief at surviving was brief. I-8 closed on the lifeboats. Through a loudhailer, a Japanese officer speaking English ordered the Tjisalak's captain to come forward or everyone would be shot. With guns trained on the lifeboats, the survivors had no choice. They rowed toward the submarine. When they reached I-8, the captain and 6 others were taken inside the submarine. These included 3 of his officers and an American Red Cross nurse who had been a passenger. The remaining survivors were ordered at gunpoint to climb onto I-8's deck. What followed was systematic slaughter conducted by the submarine's crew on the deck of their own vessel in broad daylight in the open ocean. The Japanese sailors who brought the Tjisalak survivors onto the deck robbed them of their valuables, tied their hands, and forced them to sit squatting on the deck, surrounded by armed men with submachine guns, rifles, and swords. The crew then worked their way through the prisoners in pairs. They tied survivors together 2 by 2 and dragged each pair aft of the conning tower. At that position, an execution party was waiting with samurai swords, monkey wrenches, and sledgehammers. They hacked and bludgeoned the bound, defenseless survivors. When the beating and cutting was finished, the victims were killed with gunshots and pushed into the sea. The survivors who later provided testimony described specific details that no account of this atrocity can avoid recording because the specific details are what the historical record requires. Some men were forced to watch their paired companion being murdered before being killed in turn. Men who jumped into the water to escape were shot while swimming. Several members of the I-8 crew sat in deck chairs during the massacre and used rifles to shoot at survivors in the water as a form of sport. Eyewitnesses described laughter. The Tjisalak's captain was brought up from inside the submarine to the bridge and briefly interrogated. He was then killed with a sword. The other officers who had been taken below were also killed. The American female nurse was brought back onto the deck that evening and shot to death. When I-8 sailed away from the position where the Tjisalak had sunk, virtually the entire survivor complement was dead, murdered on the deck of a Japanese naval vessel by the submarine's own crew on the orders of its commanding officer. Incredibly, 5 or 6 men survived. They survived by feigning death, by slipping into the water during moments of confusion, by managing to stay afloat and stay hidden until the submarine departed. They drifted for days on wreckage until the American Liberty ship SS James O. Wilder found them. When they reached Allied authorities, their testimony was detailed, specific, and consistent. They had names, they had descriptions, they had witnessed from their positions of concealment or temporary survival what had been done to their crewmates, and they described it with the precision of men who understood they were the only record that existed. Allied intelligence noted that I-8's patrol record from this period showed an unusual absence of survivors from multiple sinkings. The Tjisalak was not the only vessel attacked. The pattern suggested that other incidents may have occurred that produced no survivors at all and therefore left no testimony. The specific number of unrecorded atrocities from this period cannot be established. The specific nature of what was done to the survivors from those other sinkings can be inferred from the pattern that Tjisalak established. I-8 returned to base in May 1944. She underwent refit and departed again in June on another patrol targeting Allied shipping off the Moluccas and toward the East African coast. In late June, she sank a British vessel, the SS Nicolet, and took some of its survivors aboard. The pattern of what happened next was not yet fully established in the historical record from that engagement. What happened in July was documented in detail because enough men survived to describe it. On the night of July 2, 1944, I-8 encountered the SS Jean Nicolet in the Indian Ocean, approximately 700 miles south of Colombo. The Jean Nicolet was an American Liberty ship, a 7,176-ton cargo vessel bound from Australia to India, carrying war supplies. She had approximately 100 people aboard, including merchant marine crew, United States Navy armed guards, and Army passengers. 2 torpedoes struck the Jean Nicolet. The explosion set the ship ablaze, and she lost power immediately. The captain transmitted a distress signal and ordered the ship abandoned. All 4 lifeboats and several rafts got away from the sinking vessel successfully. Approximately 90 to 99 men made it off alive. As darkness fell and the Jean Nicolet burned and drifted, I-8 surfaced nearby with a searchlight cutting across the water. The searchlight found a lifeboat. Machine guns were trained on its occupants. I-8's crew ordered the survivors to come alongside under threat of immediate execution. The first group of men was forced at gunpoint to clamber onto the submarine's deck. Almost immediately before anything else happened, an I-8 crewman singled out the ship's cabin boy. He was a teenager. He was on his first voyage. The Japanese sailor shot him in the head with a pistol and kicked his body overboard. The empty lifeboat was then riddled with gunfire and sunk. The execution of the boy and the destruction of the lifeboat were signals delivered to the other survivors watching from their own boats and rafts about what was happening and what would happen to them. I-8 then moved methodically through the remaining lifeboats and rafts, forcing every group of survivors to come alongside at gunpoint and climb aboard. Anyone who tried to slip away in the darkness was chased down or shot at. One group of 5 men on a drifting raft managed to avoid detection and hide in the darkness. They were the only people from the Jean Nicolet who were not taken onto I-8 that night. As each group of survivors came aboard, they were stripped of their life jackets, their shoes, and any valuables. Their hands were bound with rope or wire. They were forced to sit on the forward deck with their heads bowed to their knees. Any man who raised his head or made a sound was beaten with iron pipes or slashed with bayonets immediately. Commander Ariumi himself came on deck at midnight, with the Jean Nicolet still burning in the distance. He or his officers addressed the remaining prisoners in what witnesses later described as a harangue. He told them that Americans were fools to fight Japan. He told them the Imperial Navy had sunk the American fleet. The claims were false. The tone was the specific tone of a man who had already decided what was going to happen and who wanted his audience to understand their helplessness before it did. Then the gauntlet began. One by one, in the small hours of July 3rd, groups of bound men were forced to move aft along the deck of I-8. They walked between 2 lines of the submarine's crew, who were armed with clubs, steel pipes, bayonets, and knives. The men who were forced to run this gauntlet were beaten and stabbed as they moved down the line. At the end of the line, a large crewman waited with a fixed bayonet. Any man still showing signs of life was impaled and thrown overboard. The men still on the forward deck waiting their turn could hear what was happening to the men ahead of them. They could not see it, they could hear it. Several men threw themselves overboard during the gauntlet rather than continue toward the end of the line. They were bound. They were in the open Indian Ocean at night with no vessel nearby except the one that was murdering them. Some of them drowned. Some of them managed to stay afloat by extraordinary effort and were eventually found by rescue vessels. Their testimony would later be among the most detailed available about what happened on I-8 that night, because their decision to jump created the slight distance from the execution that allowed them to observe and survive. Approximately 30 captives remained alive on I-8's deck as the massacre continued through the early morning hours. Then something happened that the submarine's crew had not anticipated. An Allied patrol aircraft appeared. It was almost certainly a Royal Canadian Air Force Catalina responding to the Jean Nicolet's distress signal that had been transmitted when the ship was torpedoed hours earlier. The aircraft was inbound. There was no time to clear the deck of prisoners or to move the remaining bound men below. I-8 executed an emergency crash dive. The remaining survivors on the deck went into the ocean as the submarine went under, bound men in the open sea in the dark. The Catalina arrived moments later and illuminated a scene of scattered bodies and struggling men in the water. When daylight came on July 3, 1944, the Jean Nicolet had finally sunk beneath the surface and I-8 had escaped the area. The Catalina and subsequently other aircraft searched the water. On July 4th, after approximately 30 hours adrift in the Indian Ocean, the British escort vessel, HMS Hollyhock, found and rescued 23 survivors. These men, a combination of Navy personnel, merchant mariners, and Army passengers, were all that remained of a complement of approximately 100 people. Approximately 77 men died between the torpedoing and the massacre. Most of them were not killed by torpedoes or by the sinking of their ship. They were killed on the deck of a Japanese naval submarine by the submarine's crew, on the orders of their commanding officer, with bladed weapons and iron pipes and firearms, while their hands were bound, while they were prisoners, while they had committed no offense and possessed no means of resistance. The 5 men on the raft who had avoided capture were also eventually rescued. Their testimony was consistent with the testimony of the men rescued by HMS Hollyhock. Together, these accounts produced a documented record of what I-8 had done that was detailed enough to support war crimes prosecution. I-8's operational career ended on March 31, 1945, south of Okinawa. By then, the Allied anti-submarine capability in the Pacific had reached a level of effectiveness that left Japanese submarines operating in combat zones with very limited survivability. The American destroyer USS Morrison, along with accompanying vessels, detected I-8 on the surface, attacked with depth charges and hedgehog projectiles, and sank her. Of her crew of approximately 100 men, one petty officer survived to be rescued. The rest went to the bottom with the boat. It was, as the reference account observes, a remarkably one-sided ending for a submarine whose own operations against defenseless survivors had been entirely one-sided. Commander Ariumi did not face justice for the murders committed under his orders in 1944. He was subsequently given command of the giant submarine, AS-401, one of the enormous submarine aircraft carriers that Japan had built late in the war to attack the American homeland. He commanded that vessel through the final months of the conflict. On August 30th, 1945, with I-401 en route to Japan to surrender following Japan's capitulation, Ariumi shot himself in the submarine's control room. His body was slipped into the sea. He was not alive when the submarine reached port. He was not available for prosecution. He had killed himself at approximately the same time the survivors of the Tjisalak and Jean Nicolet were finally able to give their testimony to Allied war crimes investigators. The war crimes proceedings that followed the end of the war identified 3 former I-8 crew members who could be connected to the 1944 atrocities through survivor testimony and the available evidence. One was found in the United States after the war. He was offered immunity from prosecution in exchange for providing testimony against his former crewmates. The other 2 were tried before military tribunals, convicted of war crimes for their participation in the murders of shipwreck survivors, and sentenced to prison terms. One source indicates a sentence of approximately 8 years of hard labor in at least one case. In the early 1950s, as the political landscape of post-war Asia shifted and the American occupation of Japan moved toward its conclusion, the Japanese government commuted the remaining sentences of both convicted men. They were released by approximately 1955. 10 years after the murders, the men who had participated in them were free. The specific injustice of this outcome belongs to the historical record alongside the atrocities themselves, because the historical record is not only what was done, but what was done about it, and what was done about it in this case was prosecution of 2 participants, non-prosecution of the commander who ordered it due to his suicide, immunity for a witness, and early release of the convicted men within a decade of the crime. The 77 men who died on I-8's deck in 1944 received less from the post-war justice system than the crimes committed against them required. The survivors who provided the testimony that made even this partial accountability possible deserve specific recognition because without them no accounting would have existed at all. One of those survivors was First Assistant Engineer Cornelius van Driel of the Tjisalak. Van Driel was a Dutch merchant mariner from Rotterdam who had been at sea for most of his adult life. He was 43 years old on March 26, 1944. He survived the torpedo attack, survived the loading onto I-8's deck, and survived the massacre by lying motionless among bodies and remaining still, for long enough that the crew moving through the survivors did not identify him as living. He went into the water when I-8 eventually cleared the area and was in the Indian Ocean for approximately 3 days before being found. When he reached Allied authorities, he gave a statement that covered the events of March 26th in detail. He named officers he had observed. He described specific acts he had witnessed. He described the specific methods used in the executions. He described the men who had sat in deck chairs. He described the sound. He gave his statement once and then again to different investigators over the weeks that followed, and the account was consistent in every detail that a man could consistently remember from an experience of that kind. He returned to the Netherlands after the war. He returned to the sea. Dutch maritime records show he continued working in merchant shipping through the 1950s. He gave a further statement to Dutch war crimes investigators in 1948, when they were compiling their own record of Japanese atrocities against Dutch nationals in the Pacific War. The 1948 statement added details he had not included in the original 1944 account. Not because the original was incomplete, but because the process of telling it once had made it possible to tell it more fully. He died in Rotterdam in 1967 at the age of 66. He had spent 23 years after March 26, 1944, continuing to work on the ocean that had nearly killed him, and that had killed almost everyone he was in the water with that day. His daughter, in a brief account provided to a Dutch maritime history project in 1989, described her father as a man who was direct about what had happened in a way that people who had not experienced something like it found difficult to receive. She said he had told her what happened once, in full, when she was old enough to understand it. He told her once and did not tell her again, because once was the complete account and the complete account had been given. She said he did not carry what had happened in the way that people speak of men carrying terrible experiences. He had put it somewhere else, not away, somewhere else, a place in himself where it was present, but not the thing that determined how he moved through a day.